I stood in front of 300 people at our anniversary party when my husband grabbed the microphone and said our marriage was the biggest joke he'd ever committed to, and everyone laughed like it was the punchline of the year. I walked off that stage, found a lawyer the next morning, and filed for divorce before he even woke up from his hangover. What I didn't know was that his best friend had been waiting for years to tell me the truth about why Marcus really married me, and when he finally did, 3 months later in a coffee shop on a rainy October afternoon, I realized my entire life had been built on a lie I never saw coming. If you're listening to this, and you've ever felt like your whole world just shattered in one single moment, please click that subscribe button right now because this story gets so much more complicated than anyone could imagine. And I need you here with me as I tell you everything that happened after that night. My name is Helena. I'm 32 years old, and I live in Manchester, England, where the rain never seems to stop, and the gray skies match the color my life had become without me even realizing it. I met Marcus when I was 24, fresh out of university with a degree in graphic design and absolutely no idea what I wanted to do with my life, except that I didn't want to end up working in some corporate office pushing papers until I retired. He was 27, confident in a way that made everyone in the room turn to look at him when he walked in, and he worked in finance for one of those companies that nobody really understands but everyone knows makes obscene amounts of money. We met at a mutual friend's birthday party in a pub in the Northern Quarter, one of those trendy places with exposed brick walls and craft beers that cost more than a meal, and he bought me a drink without asking what I wanted, just assumed I'd like what he was having. I should have seen that as a red flag, that assumption that he knew better than me what I needed. But I was young, and he was charming, and when he smiled at me I felt like maybe I'd finally found someone who could make sense of the chaos in my head. We dated for 2 years before he proposed. And looking back now, I realize I spent most of that time trying to mold myself into whatever version of Helena he seemed to want that particular week. Some days he wanted the fun girlfriend who would stay out until 3 a.m. and dance on tables and not care about anything serious. And other days, he wanted the sophisticated partner who could discuss wine pairings and attend his company events in designer dresses I couldn't afford, but bought anyway because I thought that's what love was. Sacrificing pieces of yourself until you fit perfectly into someone else's vision. The proposal happened on a beach in Cornwall during a summer holiday, and it was beautiful in that generic way that proposals are supposed to be, with the sunset and the sand, and him on one knee holding a ring that probably cost 3 months of his salary. I said yes because I thought that's what I was supposed to do, because all my friends were getting engaged, and my mother kept asking when I was going to settle down, and because I genuinely believed that Marcus loved me, even though I'm not sure he ever actually said those words, without it being a response to me saying them first. The wedding was everything I didn't want, but pretended I did. His mother took over the planning almost immediately, turning what I'd imagined as a small, intimate ceremony with close friends and family into this massive production with 200 guests, most of whom I'd never met, at a country estate outside Manchester that cost more than my parents' house. I wanted wildflowers and string lights and a feeling of warmth and authenticity, but instead, I got white roses and crystal chandeliers, and a photographer who kept positioning us like we were models in a catalog, rather than 2 people supposedly celebrating their love. Marcus seemed to thrive in it all, shaking hands and making jokes, and being the center of attention, while I smiled until my face hurt, and wondered if this was really what happiness was supposed to feel like. My best friend Kate pulled me aside during the reception and asked if I was okay, really okay. And I told her I was fine because admitting otherwise would mean acknowledging that I'd made a terrible mistake and it was too late to turn back now. If you're relating to any of this, if you've ever felt like you were living someone else's life instead of your own, I'd really appreciate it if you could click that subscribe button and help this channel reach 1,000 subscribers, because sharing these stories and knowing I'm not alone in these experiences is what keeps me going some days. The first year of marriage was fine in that bland way that fine actually means not good, but not bad enough to complain about. Marcus worked long hours at his firm, often not coming home until 9 or 10 at night, and I'd started freelancing as a graphic designer from our flat in Didsbury, taking on projects for small businesses and startups that couldn't afford the big agencies. I enjoyed the work, the creative freedom of it, the feeling that I was building something of my own, even if it wasn't making much money yet. Marcus never seemed particularly interested in what I was doing, would ask how my day was in that automatic way people do when they don't really want to know the answer. And I'd give him the brief version because I learned early on that talking about my work for more than 2 minutes made his eyes glaze over. He'd talk about his deals and his clients and his colleagues, and I'd nod and make appropriate sounds of interest, while internally wondering if this was really all there was to married life. Things started to shift subtly around our second anniversary. Marcus had been promoted to senior analyst or associate, or some title that came with more money and more hours and more stress that he'd bring home and deposit at my feet like a gift I never asked for. He started making comments about my freelancing, little digs disguised as concern about whether I was really making enough money, or if maybe I should consider getting a proper job with a proper salary and proper benefits. I tried to explain that I was building something, that freelancing took time to become profitable, that I actually enjoyed the flexibility and creativity of it, but he'd just shrug and say he was only thinking about our future, about what would happen when we had kids and needed financial stability. We'd never really discussed kids in any concrete way. It was always this vague someday thing. But suddenly he was talking about it like it was a foregone conclusion, and I was being irresponsible by not planning for it the way he thought I should. His best friend Oliver had been part of our lives since the beginning, actually even before the beginning, because they'd been friends since university, and Oliver was the one who'd invited Marcus to that birthday party where we met. Oliver was quieter than Marcus, more observant, worked as an architect, and actually seemed to care about creating things that mattered rather than just making money. I'd always liked him in that uncomplicated way. You like your partner's friends. Someone who was pleasant to be around at dinner parties, but not someone I'd necessarily seek out on my own. He was married to a woman named Sophie who worked in publishing, and the four of us would get together once a month or so for dinner at one of the trendy restaurants in Ancoats, or the Northern Quarter, the kind of places where the portions are tiny and the prices are astronomical. But the food is admittedly incredible. I started noticing around year 3 of my marriage that Oliver would sometimes look at me with this expression I couldn't quite read, something between concern and sadness. But whenever I'd catch his eye, he'd quickly look away and rejoin whatever conversation was happening. A few times when Marcus would make one of his little comments about my work or my appearance or my opinions, I'd see Oliver flinch slightly, and once he even interjected with something like, "I think what Helena does is really impressive, actually," which made Marcus laugh and say Oliver always was too sentimental for his own good. Sophie seemed oblivious to all of it, or maybe she just chose to be. I was never quite sure which. The cracks in my marriage weren't dramatic. They were these tiny fractures that accumulated over time until I wasn't sure what was holding us together anymore, besides inertia and the fear of admitting failure. Marcus became increasingly critical of everything I did, from how I loaded the dishwasher, to how I styled my hair, to how I spoke to his colleagues at company events. Nothing I did was ever quite right, and the praise I used to get occasionally in the early days disappeared entirely, replaced by this constant low-level criticism that made me feel like I was perpetually failing at being the wife he wanted. I tried talking to him about it once, sitting him down on a Saturday morning with coffee and telling him I felt like we were drifting apart, that I missed feeling like we were partners instead of roommates. And he looked at me like I was being dramatic and said all marriages go through phases, and I just needed to stop being so sensitive about everything. Your support really means everything to this channel. So if you haven't already, please take a second to click that subscribe button and help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. We're so close, and every single subscription matters. I threw myself into my work as a way to cope, taking on more clients and bigger projects, and actually starting to make decent money from my freelancing. I designed a full brand identity for a sustainable fashion startup that ended up getting featured in a couple of lifestyle magazines, and suddenly I had more work than I could handle and was turning down projects because I didn't have enough hours in the day. I hired an assistant, a recent graduate named Mia, who was brilliant and enthusiastic and reminded me of myself before I'd let someone else's opinions shape how I saw my own worth. My business grew. I opened a proper studio space in the northern quarter that I shared with 2 other freelancers, and for the first time in years I felt like I was actually good at something, like I had value beyond being Marcus's wife. Marcus's reaction to my success was strange and telling. Instead of being proud or supportive, he became almost competitive, like my achievements were somehow diminishing his. He'd make jokes at dinner parties about how I was probably going to leave him for some creative type who understood my artistic soul, and everyone would laugh. But there was an edge to it that made me uncomfortable. He started coming home even later, sometimes not until midnight or after, and when I'd ask where he'd been, he'd say work or drinks with clients, in a tone that suggested I had no right to question him. I wasn't stupid. I knew what late nights and defensive behavior usually meant, but I was too tired and too focused on my own work to dig into it. And part of me wondered if I even cared anymore what he was doing when he wasn't home. The anniversary party was his idea, which should have been my first clue that something was wrong, because Marcus wasn't the type to initiate grand romantic gestures. We were coming up on our 5th anniversary, and he suggested we throw a big party to celebrate, invite all our friends and family and colleagues, really make it an event. I was hesitant because I didn't particularly want to celebrate what felt like a failing marriage with 300 people watching, but he insisted, and his enthusiasm seemed genuine, and I thought maybe this was his way of trying to reconnect, of showing me that he still cared about us. I let him take the lead on planning, which meant his mother got involved again, and suddenly we had a venue booked at the same country estate where we'd gotten married, and a caterer and a band, and it was turning into this massive production that cost a fortune and felt nothing like what I would have chosen if anyone had bothered to ask. The night of the party, I wore a dress I'd designed myself, a deep emerald green that made me feel powerful and beautiful and like myself in a way I hadn't felt in years. I'd lost weight from stress and working too much and not eating properly, so the dress hung on me in a way that was elegant rather than the way I'd envisioned when I'd sketched it months earlier, but I felt good anyway. Marcus wore an expensive suit and cologne that cost more than most people's weekly grocery budget, and when I came out of the bedroom ready to leave, he looked at me for a long moment and then said, "You look good. Try to smile more tonight. People are going to think you're miserable." I should have known then what kind of evening it was going to be. The party was beautiful in that impersonal way that expensive events are, with white tablecloths, and champagne and crystal flutes, and food that was more art than sustenance. People kept coming up to me and saying how wonderful everything looked, and wasn't I lucky to have a husband who would throw such an extravagant party? And I smiled and nodded and felt like I was watching myself from outside my body, like this was happening to someone else, and I was just observing. Marcus was in his element, working the room like a politician, making everyone laugh with his stories and his charm. And I watched him and realized I didn't know this person anymore. Maybe I never had. About 2 hours into the party, Marcus clinked his glass and called for everyone's attention. He'd had quite a bit to drink by that point. I could see it in the slightly loose way he was moving and the extra volume in his voice. But I thought he was going to make a nice speech about our marriage and thank everyone for coming, and that would be that. He called me up to stand next to him on the small stage the venue had set up for the band. And I went, because that's what you do. You play your part, even when everything inside you is screaming that something is wrong. He put his arm around me, and I could smell the whiskey on his breath and feel the tension in his body. And then he started talking. He told everyone how we'd met, which was fine. That was normal anniversary speech content. But then he started talking about how he'd known from the beginning that I was too good for him, but he'd married me anyway, because he liked a challenge. People laughed, uncomfortable, but willing to go along with what they assumed was a joke. He talked about how I'd been this dreamy artist type with my head in the clouds, and he'd had to teach me about the real world, about money and responsibility, and what actually mattered in life. The laughter got quieter. Then he said, and I remember these words exactly because they're burned into my memory like a brand. He said, "I guess you could say our marriage has been the biggest joke I've ever committed to. But hey, 5 years is longer than most people gave us, so I suppose I should get some credit for that." The room went silent for a moment, and then people started laughing again, nervous and uncertain. and Marcus laughed too, like he'd just told the funniest joke in the world. I stood there on that stage in my green dress that I'd designed with my own hands, in front of 300 people who were laughing at my marriage being called a joke, and something inside me just broke clean in half. I didn't cry or yell or make a scene. I just stepped away from Marcus and walked off that stage with my head up and my shoulders back. And I didn't stop walking until I was in the car park in the cold November air without a coat, shivering and trying to remember how to breathe. Kate found me 10 minutes later and wrapped her jacket around me and asked what I needed. And I told her I needed the name of a good divorce lawyer and I needed it tonight. She didn't try to talk me out of it or suggest I sleep on it or any of the things people say when they think you're being impulsive. She just pulled out her phone and gave me her cousin's number, who happened to be a family law solicitor in Manchester, and told me to call him first thing in the morning. If this story is resonating with you, if you understand what it feels like to have a moment where everything suddenly becomes crystal clear, please subscribe to this channel right now, because your support is what makes sharing these difficult stories possible. And we're trying to build a community here of people who understand that life is messy and complicated, and sometimes you just need to hear that you're not alone. I went home that night, not to the flat in Didsbury that Marcus and I shared, but to Kate's house in Chorlton. And I slept on her couch and woke up the next morning knowing exactly what I needed to do. I called the lawyer at 9 o'clock when his office opened, explained the situation in the calm, detached voice of someone who'd already moved beyond anger into a clear-eyed determination, and he agreed to see me that afternoon. By 4 o'clock, I'd signed papers initiating divorce proceedings, and by 6 o'clock, Marcus had been served at our flat by a process server who found him still hungover from the party, or so I heard later from Kate, who heard it from someone else who was there. He called me 37 times that evening. I didn't answer once. The next few weeks were a blur of meetings with lawyers and accountants and trying to untangle 5 years of shared life into 2 separate existences. Marcus went from confused to angry to pleading and back to angry again, showing up at my studio unannounced and demanding to know why I was throwing away our marriage over a joke, why I couldn't just learn to take things less seriously, why I was being so dramatic about everything. I had the locks changed and told him through my lawyer that all communication needed to go through legal channels, and eventually he seemed to get the message and backed off. His mother called me crying and asking what she'd done wrong and couldn't we work this out, and I felt bad for her, because she genuinely seemed to care. But I also knew that staying in a marriage that made me miserable, just to avoid disappointing someone else's mother, was not a good enough reason to sacrifice my own happiness. I threw myself into work even harder than before, taking on projects that challenged me and pushed me, and made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. My business grew exponentially. I hired 3 more people, including a business manager who helped me actually structure things properly instead of just winging it the way I had been. And by the end of that year, my little freelance graphic design operation had become a proper agency with a growing reputation for innovative brand work. We moved into a bigger space in Ancoats, with exposed brick and massive windows that let in all the gray Manchester light. And I felt proud of what I'd built, proud that I'd created something that was entirely mine, and that nobody could take away from me or diminish with their comments or their jokes. The divorce was finalized 6 months after I filed, which is relatively quick as these things go, and because we didn't have kids, and I'd kept my business finances completely separate from our personal finances, the property settlement was straightforward, even if painful. We sold the flat in Didsbury and split the proceeds, divided up the furniture and the kitchen equipment and all the accumulated stuff of 5 years together, and just like that, it was over. I signed the final papers on a Tuesday afternoon in April, walked out of my lawyer's office into unexpected sunshine, and felt lighter than I had in years, despite knowing I was also completely terrified of what came next. I hadn't seen Oliver since before the anniversary party, which was strange because he and Marcus were supposedly best friends, and I would have expected him to reach out or say something, or take Marcus's side in the whole thing the way friends usually do. Sophie had sent me a brief text saying she was sorry things hadn't worked out and wishing me well, which was kind, but also felt like a door closing on that entire chapter of my life. So when Oliver called me in late October, almost a full year after that disastrous anniversary party, I was surprised enough that I actually answered, instead of letting it go to voicemail the way I had with most calls from numbers I recognized from my old life. He asked if we could meet for coffee, said he had something he needed to tell me and it had to be in person. I was wary, thought maybe Marcus had put him up to some kind of reconciliation attempt, but there was something in Oliver's voice that was serious and sad and made me think this was something else entirely. We agreed to meet at a cafe in the northern quarter, neutral territory that didn't have any memories attached to it, on a rainy afternoon that felt appropriate for whatever heavy conversation was about to happen. When I arrived, he was already there, sitting at a corner table with 2 coffees already ordered, and he looked older than I remembered, tired in a way that went beyond just physical exhaustion. He didn't waste time with small talk. He asked how I was doing, and I gave him the abbreviated version. That I was good, that my business was thriving, that I was happy in a way I hadn't been in years, even though being alone was sometimes harder than I wanted to admit. He nodded like he understood, and then he took a deep breath and said what he had to say next was going to be difficult to hear, but he couldn't carry it anymore. The guilt was eating him alive, and I deserved to know the truth, even though it was years too late to do anything about it. I felt my stomach drop, because I knew whatever he was about to tell me was going to change something fundamental about how I understood my own history. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel because what comes next is the part of the story that made me question everything I thought I knew about the last 8 years of my life, and I don't want you to miss a single detail. Oliver told me that Marcus had made a bet with him and 2 other friends from university before Marcus and I ever met. The bet was that Marcus couldn't successfully date and marry someone completely outside his usual type, someone artsy and impractical and nothing like the corporate women he usually pursued, and that if he succeeded, he'd win £5,000 from each of them. The night Marcus met me at that birthday party, he'd texted Oliver afterward saying he'd found his mark, that I was perfect for the bet because I was exactly the kind of dreamy creative type they'd specified, and he was confident he could pull it off. Oliver had tried to talk him out of it, said it was cruel and wrong to build a relationship on a lie like that. But Marcus had laughed and said it wasn't hurting anyone, and besides, he'd probably end up liking me anyway, so what was the harm? I sat there in that cafe with rain streaming down the windows, and my coffee getting cold, and tried to process what Oliver was telling me. My entire relationship with Marcus, from that first drink at the bar, to the proposal on the beach, to the wedding at the country estate, had been based on a bet. I'd been a character in someone else's game, a role he'd been playing to win money from his friends, and every time I doubted myself or tried to fit into what I thought he wanted, I'd actually been playing directly into his hands. The humiliation of it was almost physical, this wave of heat and nausea that made me grip the edge of the table to steady myself. Oliver kept talking, his words tumbling out like he'd been holding them in for too long, and now that he'd started, he couldn't stop. He said he'd paid up when we got married, had given Marcus his portion of the bet winnings, but that it had bothered him more and more over the years, as he watched me trying so hard to be what Marcus wanted, and watched Marcus treat me with less and less respect. He said he'd told Marcus multiple times that he needed to come clean, that living a lie like that wasn't fair to me, but Marcus had just laughed and said I'd never find out, and what I didn't know wouldn't hurt me. Oliver had stayed silent because he'd valued his friendship with Marcus, and because he hadn't wanted to destroy my marriage with information that couldn't be taken back. But after the anniversary party, after watching Marcus humiliate me in front of everyone we knew, he couldn't keep the secret anymore. His own marriage had ended a few months earlier. Sophie had left him for reasons he didn't fully explain, and he said that losing her had made him realize how valuable honesty was and how much damage secrets could do. I asked him why he was telling me this now, almost a year after the divorce was finalized, when the information couldn't change anything about what had already happened. He said he knew it was too late to make a practical difference, but that I deserved to know the truth about why my marriage had been the way it was, that it wasn't my fault, that there was nothing I could have done differently, because the entire foundation had been rotten from the start. He said Marcus had never actually loved me, had liked me well enough, and found me convenient, but that the whole thing had been a game to him from the beginning, and I should know that, so I didn't spend the rest of my life wondering what I'd done wrong, or how I could have saved something that was never real in the first place. I don't remember leaving the cafe or walking back to my studio, but I found myself there somehow, sitting at my desk in the empty office because everyone had gone home for the day, staring at my computer screen without seeing anything. I felt like my entire past had been rewritten, like every memory I had of my time with Marcus was now tainted with this knowledge that none of it had been what I thought it was. The proposal that I'd thought was romantic had been calculated. The wedding I'd thought was about our future together had been about him winning a bet. Every time he'd criticized me or made me feel small had been him resenting that he'd tied himself to someone he'd never actually wanted except as a game piece. It was a special kind of betrayal. Not just that he'd lied, but that my entire reality had been a construction I'd never consented to be part of. Kate came over that night when I called her crying, brought wine and takeaway, and just sat with me while I processed everything Oliver had told me. She was angry on my behalf in a way that was comforting, saying she'd always known Marcus was an asshole, but she'd never imagined he was capable of something this calculated and cruel. She asked if I was going to confront him about it, and I said I didn't know what the point would be. He'd probably just deny it or minimize it or try to spin it into somehow being my fault for not being interesting enough to want for real. The Marcus I knew wasn't capable of genuine remorse. He was only capable of being sorry he'd been caught, or that there were consequences to his actions, and I didn't need to give him another opportunity to make me feel small. But the anger came, eventually, after the shock wore off, and I'd had time to really sit with what had been done to me. I was angry at Marcus, obviously, furious in a way that felt like fire in my chest, but I was also angry at Oliver for waiting so long to tell me, angry at myself for not seeing the signs sooner, angry at everyone who'd been at that anniversary party and laughed when Marcus called our marriage a joke. I channeled that anger into my work, designing brands and campaigns with a ferocity that surprised even me, and my team started commenting that I seemed different, more confident, more willing to take risks and push boundaries. I'd always been good at my work, but now I was operating from a place of absolute certainty that I deserved success and respect, and I wasn't going to accept anything less ever again. Please take a moment right now to click that subscribe button if you haven't already, because building this channel to 1,000 subscribers means building a community of people who've survived things they never thought they'd have to survive, and I want you to be part of that. My business continued to grow. I hired more staff and took on bigger clients, and started getting approached by companies I'd only dreamed of working with when I'd first started freelancing from my flat. A major retail chain hired us to completely overhaul their brand identity, a project that took 6 months and was featured in several design publications and on industry websites. I was invited to speak at conferences about building a creative business, about finding your voice as a designer, about learning to trust your instincts and not compromise your vision for someone else's approval. I never talked about Marcus or the divorce in any of these contexts. I kept my personal life carefully separate from my professional one, but I knew that the person I was becoming professionally was directly related to having escaped a relationship that had been slowly suffocating who I actually was. I started dating again, tentatively, through apps and through friends setting me up, and once or twice with clients, which was probably professionally unwise, but they were good experiences anyway. Nobody serious. I wasn't ready for serious, and I wasn't sure I ever would be again. But it was nice to remember what it felt like to be desired for who I actually was, rather than as a game piece in someone else's competition. I went on dates where men actually listened when I talked about my work and asked follow-up questions, and seemed genuinely interested in my life, and the contrast to what I'd had with Marcus was so stark, it was almost funny. I realized I'd set the bar so low for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to be treated with basic respect and curiosity. About 18 months after Oliver's revelation, I was at an industry event in London, one of those networking things with champagne and name tags, where everyone is trying to look like they're having more fun than they actually are. I was talking to a potential client about a project when I saw Marcus across the room. He saw me at the same moment and we made eye contact, and I watched something like shock cross his face before he quickly looked away. He was there with a woman I didn't recognize, younger than me, dressed in expensive clothes and laughing at something he said in a way that looked practiced. I felt nothing. which surprised me because I'd imagined many times what it would be like to see him again, and I'd always thought I'd feel anger or hurt or something. But instead, I just felt a kind of distant pity for whoever this new woman was, and what she probably didn't know about the man whose arm she was holding. He approached me later when I was alone getting another drink at the bar. He said my name like a question, and I turned to face him with the same professional smile I'd give anyone at a networking event. He said I looked good, that he'd heard my business was doing really well, that he was happy for me. I said thank you in a tone that suggested the conversation was over, but he kept talking. He said he'd thought about me a lot, that he knew he'd mess things up between us, that he hoped we could be civil if we ran into each other at events like this, since we apparently moved in some of the same professional circles now. I felt that familiar anger starting to build, but I kept my voice level and calm when I responded. I told him I knew about the bet. I watched his face go pale, and then red, and then carefully neutral as he processed what I'd said. He started to say something, probably a denial or an excuse, but I held up my hand and told him I didn't want to hear it, that nothing he could say would change what he'd done or make it less despicable. I said I actually wanted to thank him in a way, because if he'd been a decent husband, I might have stayed comfortable and complacent, and never pushed myself to build the business and the life I had now. So in a twisted way, his cruelty had been the catalyst for me becoming the person I was always supposed to be. I could see he didn't know what to say to that. He'd probably expected me to yell or cry or make a scene, but instead, I was just calmly acknowledging that he'd been a stepping stone to something better, and he was no longer relevant to my life in any meaningful way. He tried one more time to engage, to explain himself, or justify what he'd done, but I simply walked away. I didn't need his explanations or his apologies or anything else from him, and the power in that realization was enormous. For years, I'd given him the power to define my worth, to make me question myself, to shape how I moved through the world, and now I was taking all of that power back and claiming it for myself. The woman he'd been with came looking for him a few minutes later, and I heard him tell her I was just an old friend from university, and I smiled to myself thinking about how little she knew about what she'd gotten herself into, but also knowing it wasn't my job to warn her or save her, that everyone had to learn their own lessons in their own time. The event ended, and I took the train back to Manchester that night feeling lighter and clearer than I had in months. Seeing Marcus and realizing I felt nothing, that he'd lost all power to affect me emotionally, was like a final piece clicking into place in my recovery from that relationship. I'd spent so much time being angry at him and angry at myself and angry at the situation, but somewhere along the way, without even realizing it, I'd processed that anger and moved through it into something like indifference, and indifference was so much more powerful than anger could ever be. I want to pause here and ask you again to please subscribe to this channel if you're finding value in this story, because sharing these experiences and building a community of people who understand the complexity of healing from betrayal is what this channel is all about, and every subscription helps us reach more people who might need to hear these stories. My business hit 7 figures in revenue the following year, which felt surreal and amazing and terrifying all at once. We moved into an even larger space, hired a creative director to help manage the growing team, and started getting approached by international brands that wanted us to handle their UK campaigns. I was featured in a profile in a major design magazine about successful women entrepreneurs in the creative industry. And in the interview, I talked about building a business from scratch and learning to trust my own vision and surrounding myself with people who lifted me up rather than tore me down. I didn't mention Marcus by name, but anyone who knew our history could probably read between the lines of what I was saying about not letting other people's limitations define your potential. Kate got engaged around that time to a genuinely lovely man named David, who worked as a teacher and treated her like she was the most important person in his world. And watching them together made me believe again that good relationships were possible, even if I hadn't personally experienced one yet. She asked me to be her maid of honor, and I cried when she did, because she'd been there for me through the worst period of my life, and being able to celebrate with her during one of the best periods of hers felt like the universe balancing itself out somehow. The wedding was small and intimate and full of joy, everything mine hadn't been. And standing up there next to her while she married someone who actually deserved her made me think that maybe someday I'd be ready to try again with someone who saw me as a partner rather than a prize or a game piece. I started therapy around this time, not because I thought I was broken, but because I wanted to understand myself better and process everything that had happened in a more structured way than just talking to friends over wine. My therapist was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s, named Dr. Patricia Chen, who worked from an office in Chorlton and had a way of asking questions that made me see things from angles I never would have considered on my own. We talked about patterns, about how I'd learned early in life to make myself smaller to fit other people's expectations, about how my relationship with Marcus had been an extreme version of something I'd been doing in smaller ways my entire life. She helped me see that what had happened wasn't just about one bad marriage, but about a whole way of moving through the world that I needed to unlearn if I didn't want to repeat similar patterns in the future. Through therapy, I started understanding that the betrayal I felt about the bet wasn't just about Marcus lying to me, but about feeling like I'd wasted years of my life on something that was never real. Dr. Chen helped me reframe that narrative, pointing out that those years hadn't been wasted because they'd led me to where I was now, because I'd learned things about myself and what I needed and what I absolutely wouldn't tolerate that I could only have learned through living through that experience. She said, "We often think of difficult experiences as time wasted when really they're investments in our future selves, painful lessons that make us stronger and clearer about who we are and what we deserve." That reframing helped more than I expected it to, helped me stop seeing myself as a victim of Marcus's cruelty and start seeing myself as someone who'd survived and thrived despite it. I went on a solo trip to Portugal about 2 years after the divorce, rented a little apartment in Lisbon for a month and just worked remotely and explored the city and gave myself space to think without all the noise of my regular life filling up every moment. I walked along the Tagus River and ate pastel de nata in tiny cafes and practiced my terrible Portuguese on patient locals. And somewhere during that month I realized I was happy, genuinely happy in a way that wasn't dependent on anyone else or any external validation. I liked who I was becoming, liked the business I'd built and the life I'd created, and the person looking back at me in the mirror. The version of Helena who'd stood on that stage while her husband called their marriage a joke felt like a different person entirely, someone I'd been but had grown beyond and out of. When I got back to Manchester, I made some changes, promoted my creative director to partner, and gave her equity in the business because she'd been instrumental in our growth and deserved to have ownership in what we were building together. Her name was Rashida Khan. She was 35 and brilliant, and had a vision for where the agency could go that aligned perfectly with mine, but pushed me in ways I needed to be pushed. We worked incredibly well together, balancing each other's strengths and weaknesses, and having a true partner in the business made everything feel less heavy and more possible. We celebrated the partnership over dinner at a restaurant in Spinningfields, and she told me she'd almost turned down the job when I'd first offered it years earlier, because she'd heard through the industry grapevine that I was going through a divorce, and she wasn't sure if the business would survive whatever personal chaos I was dealing with. But she'd taken a chance, and she was glad she had, because working with me had changed her career trajectory completely. I started seeing someone seriously around this time, a man named James who worked as a documentary filmmaker and had absolutely nothing to do with the corporate world Marcus had inhabited. We met at a film screening that Kate had dragged me to, one of those independent cinema things where everyone is very serious about the art form and drinks wine from plastic cups during the interval. He asked me what I thought of the film, and I gave him my honest opinion, which was that it was technically impressive but emotionally cold, and instead of being offended or defensive, he laughed and said he'd felt exactly the same way. But everyone else seemed to love it, so he'd thought maybe he was missing something. We talked for 2 hours after the screening ended, sitting on a bench outside the cinema in the cold October air, and when he asked for my number, I gave it to him without the usual hesitation I'd developed about dating. James was different from anyone I'd been with before, including and especially Marcus. He was curious about everything, asked endless questions about my work and my life and my opinions, and actually remembered the answers and brought them up in later conversations. He cooked elaborate meals in his tiny kitchen in Levenshume and made me try foods I'd never heard of from countries I'd never been to. And he talked about his documentary projects with a passion that reminded me of why I'd gotten into design in the first place. That desire to create something meaningful that connected with people. We took things slowly, both of us having been burned in previous relationships and wary of rushing into anything. But slowly felt good. Felt like we were building something solid, rather than just falling into something because it was exciting or convenient. I told him about Marcus in the bed about 4 months into dating. Not because I felt obligated to, but because I wanted him to understand why I sometimes pulled back or questioned things or needed reassurance in ways that might not make sense without context. He listened to the whole story without interrupting, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, before saying that what had been done to me was cruel and wrong, but that he was grateful in a selfish way, because if it hadn't happened, I might still be in that marriage, and he never would have met me. He said he could see how the experience had shaped me, made me stronger and more certain about what I wanted, and that he thought the woman I'd become was remarkable, even if the path to becoming her had been painful. I cried, which I hadn't expected to do, and he held me, and didn't try to fix anything or make it less heavy, just let me feel what I needed to feel. If you're still with me in this story, if you've made it this far and you're invested in what happens next, please make sure you're subscribed to this channel because we're working toward that goal of 1,000 subscribers, and your support makes all the difference in being able to keep sharing these stories. Marcus tried to contact me again about a year after I'd seen him at that London event. He sent a long email to my business address, which felt like a violation since he was using my professional contact information for personal communication. But I read it anyway out of curiosity. He wrote about how he'd been in therapy and was working on himself, and part of his process was making amends to people he'd hurt. And he wanted me to know that he was sorry for how he'd treated me during our marriage, and specifically for the anniversary party incident. He said he'd been drinking too much back then, and using humor as a defense mechanism to avoid dealing with his own unhappiness. And he recognized now that he'd been emotionally abusive, and that I deserved better than what he'd given me. The email was long and detailed, and probably took him hours to write, and I could tell his therapist had coached him on what to say, because it hit all the right notes of taking responsibility and acknowledging harm without making excuses. I didn't respond. Not because I was still angry, though part of me probably was in ways I'd buried, but because I didn't owe him anything, not even acknowledgement of his apology. His apology was about making himself feel better, about alleviating his guilt so he could move forward with his healing process, and I wasn't interested in being a supporting character in his redemption arc. I'd done the work of healing myself without any help or acknowledgement from him, and if he needed to apologize to feel better about himself, that was fine. But it didn't require anything from me. I showed the email to Dr. Chen in our next session, and she nodded, and said not responding was a perfectly valid choice. That closure wasn't something someone else could give you, but something you created for yourself. And I'd clearly already done that work without needing Marcus's participation. The business continued to thrive. We won several industry awards for campaigns we'd created, and I was invited to judge a competition for emerging designers, which made me feel old in a strange way, but also proud that I'd reached a point in my career where my opinion was valued by others in the field. Rashida and I were featured together in a podcast about women in creative industries, talking about partnership and building sustainable businesses, and the challenges of scaling while maintaining quality and creative integrity. During the interview, the host asked about work-life balance, and how we managed the demands of running an agency with personal lives. And I found myself talking about James, and how having a partner who understood creative work made it easier to navigate the intense periods when projects demanded everything, and Rashida joked that I'd become noticeably less stressed since I'd started dating him, which everyone in the office appreciated. James and I moved in together after dating for about 18 months, getting a flat in Chorlton that was bigger than either of our previous places and had room for both of us to work when we needed to. It felt significant in a way that moving in with Marcus never had. Probably because this time I was doing it from a place of choice rather than following a prescribed timeline of what relationships were supposed to look like. We painted the walls colors we actually liked instead of the safe neutrals that landlords prefer, filled the space with books and art and plants that we both contributed to, and created a home that felt like it belonged to both of us equally rather than one person's space that the other had moved into. His documentary work meant he traveled sometimes for shoots, and my business meant I occasionally had intense deadline periods where I practically lived at the studio. But we figured out how to support each other through those times, rather than resenting them the way I'd learned to resent Marcus's absences. Make sure to hit that subscribe button if you haven't yet. We're getting so close to 1,000 subscribers, and building this community means everything to me. I ran into Oliver again, randomly, at a coffee shop near my studio about 3 years after he'd told me about the bet. He looked better than he had that rainy afternoon, less haunted, and he smiled when he saw me in a way that seemed genuine. We got coffee and sat outside even though it was chilly, and he told me he'd moved to Edinburgh, was working for a firm there, and had started seeing someone new who made him remember what healthy relationships were supposed to feel like. He asked how I was doing and seemed genuinely interested in the answer, so I told him about the business and about James, and about how different my life looked now compared to when I'd been married to Marcus. He said he could see it in my face, that I seemed lighter somehow, and then he apologized again for not telling me about the bet sooner, said he'd carried guilt about that for years and hoped I didn't hold it against him. I told him honestly that I'd been angry at him for a while for waiting so long to tell me, but that I'd come to understand that he'd been in an impossible position and that ultimately knowing the truth had been a gift, even if it was a painful one. I said I thought people did the best they could with the information and emotional resources they had at any given time, and that holding grudges against people for not being perfect when none of us were perfect seemed like a waste of energy. He looked relieved, and we finished our coffee talking about lighter things, about Edinburgh and Manchester, and the differences between the cities. And when we parted ways, I felt like a chapter had finally closed completely. No lingering resentment or unfinished business. Just two people who'd been connected through a difficult situation and had both moved beyond it into better versions of their lives. Marcus got married again. I heard through mutual acquaintances that still occasionally crossed my path at industry events, or through social media algorithms that insisted on showing me people I'd deliberately disconnected from. He married the woman he'd been with at that London event. Or maybe it was someone different. I didn't care enough to investigate closely. Someone sent me a screenshot of a wedding photo that had been posted online. Thinking I'd want to know, or maybe thinking I'd be upset, but I just felt that same indifference I'd felt when I'd seen him in person. I hoped for her sake that he'd actually changed and grown and learned how to be a decent partner, but I also knew that people rarely changed in fundamental ways without doing serious work on themselves, and I doubted Marcus had done that work given what I knew about his capacity for self-reflection. But it wasn't my problem anymore. Wasn't my job to warn her or worry about her, and I deleted the screenshot and went back to my own life without giving it another thought. James proposed to me on a completely ordinary Tuesday evening, no grand gesture or elaborate planning, just the two of us making dinner together in our flat, and him suddenly saying that he wanted to spend the rest of his life with me and would I marry him. I said yes immediately, without the hesitation or doubt I'd felt when Marcus had proposed, because this felt entirely different, felt like a choice I was making from a place of strength and clarity rather than something I was doing because it was expected, or because I was afraid of being alone. We didn't tell many people at first, just sat with it ourselves for a few weeks. And then we told our closest friends and family at a small gathering we threw at our flat. Nothing fancy, just people we loved eating food and drinking wine and celebrating with us in a way that felt authentic to who we were. We planned a small wedding, maybe 50 people, at a venue in the Peak District that we'd visited on a hiking trip and fallen in love with. No country estate, no massive production, no parents taking over the planning, just us making decisions together about what we wanted and what felt meaningful. Kate was my maid of honor, obviously, and Rashida was a bridesmaid along with my sister, and James's brother was his best man. We wrote our own vows, which felt terrifying but important, And I stood up there in front of 50 people who actually knew and loved us both, and promised to be a partner in all the ways that word was supposed to mean. And I meant every word without reservation or doubt. The difference between this wedding and my first one was stark, not just in size or style, but in the feeling of it. The sense that this was a beginning of something beautiful, rather than a performance for other people's benefit. Please take a second to subscribe to this channel if you're enjoying this story, because your support helps us reach that goal of building a community of 1,000 people who understand that life doesn't always go the way we plan, but we can still create something beautiful from the broken pieces. Married life with James was everything. Married life with Marcus hadn't been. We were partners in the actual sense of the word, making decisions together and supporting each other's goals and navigating challenges as a team, rather than as two people living parallel lives that occasionally intersected. He came to my business events and actually talked to people about their work with genuine interest, and I went to screenings of his documentaries and felt proud of what he was creating and contributing to the world. We had disagreements, obviously. We were both strong-willed people with opinions, but we'd learned how to fight fair and actually resolve things rather than letting resentments build up into walls between us. I'd never known that marriage could feel like this, like safety and excitement at the same time, like coming home and going on an adventure all at once. The business hit a new milestone. We were acquired by a larger agency group that wanted our creative approach and our client roster, but agreed to let Rashida and I continue running things independently under their umbrella. The acquisition meant financial security in a way I'd never had before, meant I could stop worrying about payroll and overhead, and whether we'd make enough this quarter to cover expenses. It also meant more resources, access to the parent company's international networks and capabilities, opportunities to pitch for bigger projects than we ever could have handled on our own. Rashida and I celebrated by taking the entire team to Barcelona for a long weekend, all expenses paid, just to say thank you for the work everyone had put in to get us to this point. Standing on a rooftop bar overlooking the city with my business partner and our team, all of us laughing and celebrating, I felt overwhelmed by how far I'd come from that woman standing on a stage being humiliated in front of 300 people. I started mentoring young designers, particularly women who were trying to build their own businesses or navigate male-dominated corporate creative departments. I'd meet with them for coffee and listen to their challenges and share what I'd learned. Not just about design and business, but about advocating for yourself and not making yourself smaller to fit other people's expectations. So many of them reminded me of myself at 24, talented and capable but unsure, looking for permission from someone else to be who they already were. I told them what I wished someone had told me, that their vision mattered, that compromise was sometimes necessary but shouldn't become a habit, that the right people would value them for exactly who they were, and the wrong people would always find something to criticize, so they might as well be themselves and attract the right ones. One of my mentees, a brilliant 26-year-old designer named Priya, told me during one of our coffee meetings that I'd changed her life by believing in her work and encouraging her to start her own studio instead of staying in a corporate job that was draining her creativity. She said she'd been about to give up on design entirely and go back to school for something more practical when we'd met, and our conversations had reminded her why she'd fallen in love with the work in the first place. I got choked up hearing that, realizing that the painful experiences I'd gone through had equipped me to help others avoid similar pitfalls, or at least navigate them with more tools than I'd had. It gave meaning to what had happened with Marcus, made it feel like those years hadn't been wasted, but had been preparation for being able to offer something valuable to others who were struggling. James and I talked about kids sometimes, in that tentative way people do when they're not sure if they want them, but feel like they should want them, because that's what married couples are supposed to do. We ultimately decided we were happy with our life as it was, with the flexibility to travel and focus on our work, and be spontaneous without having to coordinate childcare. It felt like another way I was choosing my own path, rather than following someone else's script, acknowledging that there wasn't one right way to have a fulfilling life, and that we got to define what fulfillment meant for us. Some people in our lives didn't understand that choice, asked when we were going to start a family with the implication that we weren't a real family without children. But we learned to smile and change the subject, rather than justify decisions we'd made for ourselves that didn't require anyone else's approval. I want to pause again and ask you to subscribe if you haven't already, because we're building something special here, and every single subscriber brings us closer to that goal of 1,000 people who are part of this community. On what would have been my 10th wedding anniversary with Marcus, had we stayed married, I was in New York for a design conference. James was with me. We'd made a trip of it and spent a few extra days exploring the city and eating at restaurants we'd read about and seeing a couple of shows on Broadway. The actual anniversary date didn't occur to me until I was looking at my phone that morning and saw the date and realized what it meant, or what it would have meant in an alternate version of my life. I mentioned it to James over breakfast, and he asked how I felt about it, and I realized I felt absolutely nothing. No sadness or anger or even relief. Just a kind of neutral acknowledgement that time had passed, and that date no longer held any meaning for me beyond being a Tuesday in October. That evening, after the conference sessions ended, we walked through Central Park as the sun was setting. The light golden and soft through the trees that were just starting to turn autumn colors, and James asked me if I ever regretted how things had turned out, if I ever wondered what my life would have looked like if Marcus had been different, or if I'd tried harder to make the marriage work. I thought about it honestly before answering, really considered whether there was any part of me that wished things had gone differently, and I realized there wasn't. I told James that I was grateful for exactly the path I'd taken, including the painful parts, because every single experience had led me to exactly where I was supposed to be, standing in Central Park with someone who actually loved and respected me, with a successful business I'd built from nothing, with a sense of myself that was solid and unshakable, in a way it never could have been if I'd stayed comfortable in a relationship that was slowly diminishing me. The conference itself was energizing. I gave a talk about building creative businesses in uncertain times, and the room was packed and people asked thoughtful questions, and several attendees came up to me afterward to say the talk had resonated with them or to ask for advice on their own ventures. One woman, probably in her mid-40s, told me that hearing me talk about leaving a marriage that wasn't serving me and building something better had given her courage to leave her own difficult relationship, that she'd been feeling stuck and scared, and my story had reminded her that it was possible to start over and create something beautiful from the wreckage. I hugged her, this stranger who'd just shared something so personal, and told her she was braver than she knew, and that the fact that she was even considering leaving meant she already knew in her heart what she needed to do. She just needed permission to trust herself, and I was giving her that permission if she needed it. Flying back to Manchester a few days later, sitting next to James on the plane and watching the sun rise over the Atlantic, I felt this profound sense of contentment that I'd never experienced before. Not happiness exactly, though I was happy, but something deeper and more settled. A sense that my life was exactly what it was supposed to be, and that I was exactly who I was supposed to be. The turbulence I'd experienced, the betrayal and humiliation and pain, had been necessary to shake loose all the parts of myself I'd been suppressing, to fit someone else's vision of who I should be. Marcus had done me a terrible thing, but in doing so, he'd accidentally given me the greatest gift, which was the motivation to find out who I actually was, when I wasn't trying to be what someone else wanted. Rashida and I expanded the business again, opened a small office in London to better serve our growing roster of clients in the South, and hired a managing director to run it so we could maintain our focus on the creative work rather than getting bogged down in operations. The London office was successful almost immediately, brought in several major accounts, and attracted top creative talent who wanted to work with us specifically because of the reputation we'd built for doing innovative work and treating our staff well. We were featured in the Financial Times, in an article about agencies that were disrupting the traditional model, and reading that article I barely recognized myself in the accomplished business owner they were describing, so far removed from the woman I'd been a decade earlier who'd been afraid to charge what her work was worth. I maintained my therapy sessions with Dr. Chen even though I was in a good place mentally, viewing them as maintenance rather than crisis management, and she'd commented several times on how much I'd grown over the years we'd been working together. In one session, she asked me what I thought my younger self, the Helena who'd been standing on that stage at the anniversary party, would think if she could see me now. And I had to take a moment because the question hit me harder than I expected. I said I thought she'd be proud, but also maybe wouldn't believe it was possible. Wouldn't believe that someone could go from that level of humiliation and loss to building something this solid and meaningful. Dr. Chen smiled and said that was exactly why it was important to tell our stories. Because someone else's younger self might be standing on their own version of that stage right now, and knowing that survival and thriving were possible might be exactly what they needed to hear. So that's partly why I'm telling you this story now. Why I'm sharing all these details about the worst and best periods of my life with strangers on the internet. Because I know there's someone listening who might be in their own version of my story, maybe still in the marriage or relationship that's slowly killing who they are. Or maybe they just got out and they're terrified and they don't know how they're going to rebuild their life. And I want them to know that it's possible. Not just to survive, but to actually thrive, to build something better than what you lost. Because what you lost wasn't actually serving you, even if it was familiar and comfortable. The unknown is terrifying, but sometimes it's exactly where you need to become who you're supposed to be. Please subscribe to this channel right now if this story is speaking to you, because we're so close to 1,000 subscribers and every single one matters in building this community of people who understand that our worst moments don't define us, but they do shape us, and sharing that with each other makes us all stronger. Marcus reached out one more time, about 5 years after our divorce was finalized, with a message through LinkedIn of all places. He said he'd seen the Financial Times article about the business and wanted to congratulate me on my success, said he'd always known I had potential, even if he hadn't done a good job of supporting it when we were together. The message felt slimy somehow, like he was trying to take some credit for my success by claiming he'd seen my potential, as if his recognition of my abilities had been what mattered rather than the actual work I'd done. I deleted the message without responding, blocked him on that platform as I'd blocked him everywhere else, and felt nothing but mild annoyance that he'd managed to intrude on my thoughts even briefly. James and I bought a house, a proper house with a garden in Didsbury, ironically, though a different neighborhood from where Marcus and I had lived. It needed work, but we could see the potential, spent weekends stripping wallpaper and painting walls and gradually turning it into a space that felt like ours. We got a dog, a rescue collie mix named Scout, who was anxious and needed patience, but who attached himself to us with a devotion that was touching. Coming home to Scout and James and our half-renovated house felt more like home than anywhere I'd ever lived, including and especially the pristine flat I'd shared with Marcus, where everything had looked perfect, but nothing had felt real. The agency celebrated its 10th anniversary, which felt momentous given that most creative businesses fail within the first 5 years. We threw a party for clients and staff and friends. Nothing like that disastrous anniversary party from my first marriage, but a genuine celebration of what we'd built and the people who'd helped us build it. I gave a short speech thanking everyone who'd contributed to our success, thanking Rashida specifically for being the partner I never knew I needed, and I got emotional in a way I hadn't expected to. Overwhelmed by how much my life had changed in a decade and how many good people I'd found along the way. Rashida hugged me afterward and said she was grateful every day that she'd taken a chance on working with a woman going through a divorce who might not have had her shit together, and we both laughed because we'd come so far from those uncertain early days. Looking back now from the vantage point of being 41 years old, married to someone who actually loves and respects me, running a successful business with a partner I trust completely, I can see that everything that happened with Marcus had to happen exactly the way it did for me to end up here. Not because there was some grand plan, or because suffering builds character, or any of that toxic positivity nonsense, but because the specific circumstances of that betrayal pushed me to make changes I probably wouldn't have made otherwise. I might have stayed comfortable and small, might have kept my freelancing as a side thing, and gotten a corporate job for the stability Marcus kept insisting I needed, might have spent my whole life wondering what I could have accomplished if I just believed in myself more. Instead, I was forced to believe in myself because there was nobody else to believe in. Forced to build something from nothing because the foundation I'd thought I had turned out to be rotten. And in that forcing, I found out I was capable of so much more than I'd ever imagined. I don't believe in forgiveness as a requirement for healing, despite what every self-help book and therapist seems to suggest. I haven't forgiven Marcus for what he did, and I probably never will. And that's okay. I've healed anyway. Forgiveness implies that what he did was somehow acceptable or understandable, and it wasn't. It was cruel and calculating and wrong, and I'm allowed to acknowledge that while also moving forward with my life. I don't think about him with hatred or even with much emotion at all anymore. He's become irrelevant to my life in every meaningful way, and that indifference is so much more powerful than forgiveness could ever be. He doesn't get my energy anymore. Not my anger or my pain or my forgiveness. He just gets nothing because he's earned nothing. What I have learned is that the stories we tell ourselves about our lives matter enormously. For years, I told myself a story where I was the victim of Marcus's cruelty, where I'd been tricked and betrayed and humiliated. And that story was true, but it wasn't complete. The more complete story is that I was someone who survived a difficult experience and used it as fuel to build something remarkable, who learned from betrayal how to recognize real partnership when I found it, who turned humiliation into motivation and came out the other side stronger and clearer about who I was and what I deserved. Both versions of the story are true, but the second one is the one I choose to live in most of the time, because it gives me agency and power, rather than keeping me stuck in victimhood. If you've stayed with me through this entire story, thank you. And please make sure you're subscribed to this channel, because building this community to 1,000 subscribers means building a space where people can share these complicated, messy human experiences and know they're not alone in whatever they're going through. I saw Oliver one last time, completely by chance, at a design conference in Edinburgh where I'd been invited to speak. He was there with his girlfriend, now fiancée, and they looked happy in that uncomplicated way happy couples do. We had coffee again and caught up properly, and he told me he'd cut ties with Marcus a couple years earlier, that maintaining that friendship had become impossible once he'd really confronted what kind of person Marcus was and what he'd been complicit in by staying silent about the bet for so long. He said ending that friendship had been difficult, but necessary, part of his own work to become a better person and surround himself with people who shared his values. I respected that, told him it took courage to end long friendships when they no longer served who you were trying to become. And he said he'd learned that from watching me walk away from my marriage, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is acknowledge that something isn't working and let it go even when it's terrifying. The business continues to grow and evolve. We're working on some of the most interesting projects we've ever taken on, and I still love the work as much as I did when I was freelancing from my flat a decade ago. James is developing a documentary series that's been picked up by a streaming service, which means he'll be traveling more over the next year. But we've talked about how to make that work, and we're both excited for him. Scout is getting older and slower, but still greets us at the door every evening like we've been gone for weeks instead of hours. Kate and David have 2 kids now who call me Auntie Helena, and who I spoil with presents and attention whenever I see them. My parents, who worried about me so much during the divorce, have relaxed now that they can see I'm genuinely happy and settled in a way I never was with Marcus. Life isn't perfect. There are still hard days and challenging projects and moments when I doubt myself or worry about the future. But the difference now is that I have a foundation that's solid, built on my own achievements and my own self-knowledge, rather than on someone else's approval or validation. I know who I am in a way I didn't when I was 24 or even 32. Know what I'm capable of, and what I deserve, and what I absolutely will not tolerate. That knowledge, earned through pain and struggle and surviving what I didn't think I could survive, is worth more than any easy path could have given me. So to anyone listening who's standing on their own version of that stage right now, or who's just walked off it and doesn't know what comes next, I want you to know that you're going to be okay. More than okay, eventually. You're going to be better than you ever imagined you could be. Not because suffering makes you stronger in some automatic way, but because you're going to choose to use this experience as fuel instead of letting it define you as a victim. You're going to surprise yourself with what you're capable of, When you stop trying to fit into someone else's vision of who you should be and start building your own version of success and happiness. It won't happen overnight, and it won't be easy, but it will be worth it. I promise you that. Thank you for listening to my story, for staying with me through all the twists and turns and difficult moments. If you found value in this, if it helped you feel less alone or gave you hope that things can get better, please subscribe to this channel and help us build this community to 1,000 subscribers. Share your own stories in the comments if you feel comfortable, because every voice matters, and every experience contributes to our collective understanding that we're all just trying to figure this out as we go, and none of us have all the answers, but together we have more wisdom and strength than any of us have alone. I'll be back with more stories soon, but for now, thank you for being here with me. And remember that your story isn't over just because one chapter ended badly. The best parts might still be ahead of you, waiting for you to be brave enough to write them.